For years, the West treated Africa as a supplier cheap minerals in, finished products out, cobalt, lithium, manganese, rare earths, the raw materials that power electric cars, smartphones, and modern weapons quietly flowed westward, but that arrangement is breaking. Across Africa, governments are tightening the tap, restricting exports, banning raw mineral shipments, and demanding processing happen at home. Factories in the West are feeling it, supply chains are stalling, prices are climbing, and what's shocking Washington and Brussels isn't just the bans themselves, it's how much leverage Africa suddenly has. For most of the modern global economy, critical minerals were treated as background inputs, essential, but assumed to be endlessly available. The West built entire industries on that assumption. Electric vehicles rely on lithium, cobalt, and nickel. Renewable energy depends on rare earths and copper. Defense systems need specialized metals for precision and durability. And Africa sits at the center of it all. The continent holds a dominant share of the world's cobalt, vast lithium deposits, major reserves of manganese, graphite, platinum, and rare earth elements. Yet for decades, that geological power translated into very little strategic leverage. Why? Because Africa mostly exported raw ore. Unprocessed minerals were shipped out cheaply, refined elsewhere, turned into high-value products, then sold back at a premium. The profits accumulated abroad, the jobs followed the processing plants, and African economies remained exposed to price swings they couldn't control. This system wasn't accidental, it was structural. Western supply chains were designed for efficiency, not balance. Mining concessions favored foreign firms, contracts prioritized volume over value addition, and global trade rules encouraged openness, even when openness locked producers into the lowest rung of the value ladder. But something began to change in the last decade. As demand for critical minerals exploded, driven by electric vehicles, green energy transitions, and geopolitical competition, African leaders started asking a different question: why export the future without owning it? The turning point wasn't ideology, it was vulnerability. When supply chains fractured during global crises, African exporters realized how dependent the West was and how little insurance Africa had. When prices surged, profits still flowed outward. When prices collapsed, African economies absorbed the shock. That imbalance became politically unsustainable, so governments began rewriting the rules. Some imposed export bans on raw minerals, allowing shipments only after local processing. Others raised royalties, tightened licensing, or mandated joint ventures with domestic firms. Several required that refining, battery-grade processing, or industrial manufacturing happen inside their borders. These weren't random acts of defiance. They were strategic moves to capture value, and they hit the West harder than expected, because Western industries weren't prepared. Decades of globalization had optimized supply chains for cost, not resilience. Processing capacity was concentrated in a handful of countries. New facilities take years to build. Environmental regulations. Slow expansion. Skilled labor is scarce. When African mineral policies tightened, the assumption of endless supply collapsed overnight. Battery manufacturers faced shortages. EV timelines slipped, defense contractors scrambled for alternatives. Suddenly, Africa's decisions were dictating outcomes in Detroit, Berlin, and Tokyo. This wasn't Africa punishing the West. It was Africa correcting a structural imbalance. But the consequences felt disruptive because the West had grown accustomed to control without ownership. Another factor accelerated the impact: coordination. While Africa is not acting as a single unified bloc, similar policies emerged across multiple countries at roughly the same time. Export restrictions in one country coincided with processing mandates in another. The cumulative effect rippled through global markets, and unlike oil shocks of the past, these disruptions weren't temporary. Critical mineral supply chains are sticky. Refineries can't relocate overnight. Alternative sources aren't easily scalable. Recycling infrastructure isn't ready to fill the gap. The West discovered a harsh reality: dependence had quietly become vulnerability. At the same time, Africa's bargaining position improved. Countries could now demand technology transfer. They could negotiate longer-term contracts at better prices. They could insist on industrial development tied to resource extraction. Minerals stopped being commodities alone, they became leverage. This is why the phrase "hitting the West harder than expected" isn't exaggeration. The West assumed Africa's policies would be symbolic. Instead, they were structural. And the shock wasn't just economic, it was psychological. For the first time in decades, Africa wasn't reacting to global rules, it was shaping them. That shift signals something larger than mineral policy. It marks a transition from passive participation to strategic control, not aimed at confrontation, but at autonomy. And it forces a difficult question for Western economies. What happens when the world's most essential resources are no longer governed by convenience but by sovereignty? That's where this story deepens. The moment Africa's mineral policies tightened, the global response split into three very different reactions: confusion in the West, opportunity for China, and leverage for Africa. Western governments were caught between competing realities. Publicly, they spoke about partnerships, sustainability, and shared prosperity. Privately, executives and policymakers confronted a supply chain architecture that had been built for a world that no longer existed. For decades, the West outsourced the most complex, environmentally sensitive, and capital-intensive parts of mineral processing. Refining cobalt, lithium, rare earths, and manganese was expensive, slow to permit, and politically unpopular at home. It was easier to source materials cheaply from abroad and keep domestic industries clean. That trade-off had worked until African countries began insisting that the value-adding steps stay within their borders. Western firms faced a hard choice: invest billions in African processing infrastructure under new rules and shared ownership, or walk away and risk shortages that could cripple entire industries. Many hesitated. China did not. China had already spent years embedding itself deep into Africa's mineral ecosystem. Long before export bans became common, Chinese firms financed roads, ports, power plants, and industrial parks near mining regions. Refining capacity followed quietly. So did technical training, logistics networks, and long-term offtake agreements. When Africa tightened export policies, China wasn't scrambling to adapt, it was positioned to comply. Processing mandates that rattled Western firms often aligned perfectly with Chinese business models. Local refining requirements meant facilities already existed or could be scaled quickly. Joint ventures were familiar territory. Long timelines didn't scare investors backed by state-aligned financing. As a result, mineral flows didn't stop, they rerouted. Instead of raw or moving west for processing, semi-processed and refined materials increasingly moved east or stayed on the continent for downstream manufacturing. For Africa, this shift created something rare in global trade: optionality. Governments were no longer forced to accept the first buyer or the lowest price. Multiple suitors wanted access not just to resources but to stable, long-term supply under new conditions. That competition strengthened Africa's negotiating hand. Countries could demand infrastructure investment alongside mining rights. They could insist on local employment quotas and skills transfer. They could tie mineral access to broader industrial development. This wasn't idealism, it was leverage meeting strategy. In the West, the realization came slowly and then all at once. Battery producers discovered they couldn't scale EV production without secure mineral inputs. Defense planners recognized that strategic systems depended on supply chains exposed to foreign policy shifts beyond their control. Energy transition timelines began slipping under material constraints. Policymakers spoke of reshoring and friendshoring, but the reality was stubborn. Building processing facilities in Western countries could take a decade. Environmental reviews, community opposition, labor shortages, and capital costs slowed everything. Meanwhile, Africa's timelines were shorter and backed by political urgency. Critical mineral restrictions became part of national development plans. Leaders framed them not as protectionism but as sovereignty. The logic resonated with domestic audiences that had seen wealth extracted for generations with limited return. International institutions warned of trade disruption. Markets complained about uncertainty. But the policies held, because walking them back would mean admitting that the old model was still acceptable. It wasn't. Another dynamic deepened the impact: coordination through imitation. As one country imposed processing requirements and survived the initial backlash, others followed. Policymakers watched carefully. Revenues rose, industrial projects materialized, foreign investment adjusted rather than withdrew. The lesson spread quietly: control worked. This cascade effect mattered more than any single ban. Global supply chains are built on predictability. When multiple sources become conditional at once, risk premiums surge. Investors demand guarantees. Manufacturers hedge or delay expansion. Africa didn't need to act as a cartel. Structural alignment was enough. As mineral leverage shifted, alliances began to recalibrate. China doubled down on long-term contracts and industrial ecosystems. Western nations rushed to renegotiate access under new terms, often offering development finance, technology partnerships, and security cooperation in exchange. Africa suddenly found itself at the center of global courtship, but this moment carried its own risks. Rapid leverage attracts pressure. Western diplomats warned of overdependence on China. Think tanks cautioned African governments about debt, environmental costs, and political entanglement. The language of values returned louder than it had been during decades of unequal trade. African leaders listened, but from a different position than before. This time, the conversation wasn't about whether Africa deserved value addition. It was about who would help deliver it and on whose terms. That distinction mattered. Countries began diversifying partnerships. Some welcomed Western firms back under revised contracts. Others balanced Chinese investment with regional integration efforts. Processing zones were designed not just for export but for domestic and continental markets. The minerals weren't the end goal, industrialization was. The West's discomfort stemmed from a deeper shift than resource access. For the first time since decolonization, Africa was shaping global industrial trajectories rather than reacting to them. Decisions made in African capitals now influenced inflation forecasts, manufacturing targets, and energy transitions thousands of miles away. That kind of influence had consequences. It forced Western economies to confront the costs of decades of dependency masked as efficiency. It revealed that supply security cannot be separated from political relationships, and it exposed how fragile global systems become when concentrated in the hands of a few actors or taken for granted. Africa's mineral policies didn't collapse the global economy, but they bent it, and once bent, systems rarely snap back to their original shape. What comes next is even more consequential. Because as processing capacity grows and downstream manufacturing expands, Africa's role shifts again from resource gatekeeper to industrial competitor. When batteries, components, and advanced materials are produced closer to the source, the geography of value creation changes permanently. That future isn't guaranteed. It requires governance, infrastructure, and regional stability. Mistakes will be made, setbacks will happen, but the direction is clear. Africa is no longer asking for a seat at the table, it's building its own and inviting the world to negotiate there. And for the West, the most uncomfortable realization may be this: the era of easy access is over, the era of negotiated dependence has begun.